Ray, if you tell me your name and when you were born, to start with, so we'll have that.
My name is Walter Ray Burns. I was born in 1947 in a mill village called Henry River Mill Village in Burke County, North Carolina.
Were you born at the village or hospital? Where was that?
I was born at the hospital in Catawba County, Richard in Fry Hospital, but my parents lived in the boarding house. They had just been given jobs at Henry River Mill Village, and so we lived in 2 rooms of the boarding house. And we lived there for about 6 months, and then were able to get 2 rooms of a house that was built for the mill workers. And so we lived in those 2 rooms for until I was 18 years old.
Tell me a little bit about your mother and father. How did they get to the village? How did they end up there?
My mother and father were Scotch-Irish, separate families. These Scotch-Irish families, at least in my family tree, one lived up the river and the other one lived down the river. They both, my grandfathers, both worked as loggers. They did sawmill work. One grandfather never ever worked in a public company doing public work in his life. So until he died, he had never had a job that he paid Social Security into. And my other grandfather worked in the Henry River Mills. Both families lived up the holler. Scotch-Irish, they didn't want people to know their business, and so they moved back up in the hollers as far as they could. And usually they were tenant farmers. And how well the crops did was a big concern to them, because if the crops didn't do well, what would the winters be like? You know, what would the next year be like? As a matter of fact, my grandfather married my grandmother, and she was young. She was about 14 years old. As it turns out, her father had given my grandfather a sum of money to marry his daughter. It was one less mouth to feed. And so my grandfather was about 10 years older than my grandmother. So they were living from season to season in ramble shacks, didn't have access to a lot of ways to earn money. So when they were offered an opportunity to move to a village where housing was provided, they had a roof over their head, they had a paycheck, or in those days it was cash. They had an envelope that came in every Friday afternoon. It was a step up for them.
Your siblings, how many were they in your family?
I was the oldest of 3. I was born July 6, 1947. My sister was born July 20th, 1949, and my brother was born July 18th, 1951. So we were all 2 years apart, and it must have been those cool October nights that caused us to be so close. And
when you moved to the house from the boarding house, how old were you then, or you didn't have that house when you were born, right?
No, we didn't have that house. I was probably 2 years old. I remember when my brother was born, I was 4, And I remember my mother coming home in a taxi and had this little thing in her arms, and my life changed forever with that child. And that was in front of the house that I lived in until I went away to college at 18.
What was it like growing up in that house? What was that house like? And was it a typical mill house?
It was a typical mill house. After, it was a four-room house, and it had two families that lived in this four-room house. So we had two rooms, and my uncle and my aunt had another two rooms. They moved out and got one of the houses on the backside, we called it the dog trot, for themselves. So a woman by the name of Blanche Hames and her son Rick moved into the house. They were able to get one of the smaller houses on the Mill Village. So this house then had four rooms available. My father was able to get the other two rooms, and so for most of my life we lived in a four-room house.
What was your mother's name?
My mother's name was Margaret Virginia Stillwell, Stillwell. And for her that was important. Many Stillwells spell their names differently, Stillwell. And it was important to her that it be done the way she wanted it done. She was the oldest of 10 children.
She grew up in that area?
She grew up in that area. Her father worked in the mill for a while, and her mother worked in the mill. And both of them lived in the Mill Village at one period of time.
Both of them being her mother and father?
Her mother and father.
So you weren't the first generation to grow up in the mill house?
No. And on my paternal side, they too lived in the village for a period of time. And then they moved to a house that one of the Rudisill owners of the mill had purchased. It was on his farm, and my grandfather Otis Burns ran the farm. So he was a tenant farmer for the Rudisills that owned the village.
Where did your mother and father meet? They meet in the village?
No, they met in the mill, as a matter of fact. My father came home from the war and started to work at the mill where my mother was working. He was rather shy, introverted. My mother told me the day that she first saw him, he was at the end of her frames. She was doing her work, and this short fella looked down the frames and saw her at the end, and he sort of played cat and mouse. He had just returned from Europe, where he was the jeep driver and short order cook for General Eisenhower. He stayed in Europe a year longer because he enjoyed doing just that. So 2 weeks after he first saw my mother, he asked her to marry him. 2 weeks.
And just because he had seen her?
Just
Wow.
because he had seen her.
And they were married, the only marriages they ever had?
The only marriages they ever had. They were in the same marriage for 48 years. I think it was 48 years.
Were they living in the mill village when they eventually passed away? Or when did they leave the mill village?
No, they left the mill village in the mid-70s. The mill had closed. My father then worked in a cotton mill in Hickory for about 4 years. My mother left the cotton mill and started working at first in a sock factory and then did some work in furniture. They continued to work in factories all their lives. They moved away from the village to my grandfather's home, the Stillwells, off of the Johnson Bridge Road, when my grandmother died and the house was available. That was the first time they had ever lived in houses with running water. And within a few years, I bought them a house that had belonged to another family member at the bottom of the mountain where my mother grew up. And my mother lived there until her death with my sister. My father was living in my grandparents' house when he died.
The house that they lived in the village, did you have to pay rent for that, or was that part of the?
We did have to pay rent. It was a challenge for my dad at times. They paid $18 a month, but that included electricity. I remember my father saying on many occasions that when I leave Henry River, it'll be with my toes turned up. And it wasn't quite like that, but he was happy where he was. He was a devoted employee, and the mill was his life. I also remember him saying, "I'll tell you one damn thing, and that is that these people come around here wanting us to unionize. They better not talk to me. We ain't having no unions at Henry River."
Did your mother and father work in the mill at the same time, and how did you handle meals and seeing them? Did you have dinner together?
We